very welcome to this research seminar. It's been a little bit of a break with all kind of nice weather and different kind of breaks that we have in Sweden in the spring. But I'm very, very happy to have, again, Ingrid Robeyns here. Very welcome. Who's going to speak about, in this world, what should the very wealthy do? And Ingrid is a philosopher and I guess an economist, you could say. And you got your PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2003 and on gender inequality and a capability approach, supervised by no less than Amartya Sen. And now you're a professor at the Ethics Institute of Utrecht, University in the Netherlands. And you are directing the project Visions for the Future, very fitting for us, funded by the Dutch Research Council. And you have for a long time worked on many issues in contemporary political philosophy and applied ethics, and done quite a lot of stuff in applied and non-ideal normative philosophy. And also, which we do here too, interdisciplinary research. Of course, you're most famous now for your book, Limitarianism. I think you coined this term, but I'm not sure. You can tell us about that. But this book has really traveled very well, and you get interviewed all the time about it. So, let us know, who are wealthy and what are we going to do? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming to this talk, and thanks, Gustav, for the invitation. And I'm really delighted to be here because I really look to what the Institute for Future Studies is doing, and it's, I mean, really for me like an example of how ideally academic work, I mean, scholarly work would happen, but in many instances it's not possible, also because of the interdisciplinarity, which is basically broadly informing my work. It's one of the privileges of getting older that one cares less whether something fits into a certain pigeonhole. Now, I have made a new presentation, so it's the first time I'm presenting this, so I'm slightly more nervous than normal, and I'm also really looking forward to getting your thoughts and comments and criticisms. And the question I'm asking is, indeed, in this world, what should the very wealthy do? Okay, so basically, I'll give you how I came to asking this question, and that came because of the book that I wrote slightly over 2 years ago. In this book that Gustav just showed, I basically argue why I believe there should be an upper limit to how much wealth we can have as a moral norm. What that implies politically is a different set, but I give all these reasons why wealth actually, when it accumulates and becomes too concentrated, becomes a harm to society, to political processes. It's incompatible with ecological duties and so forth. I won't talk about the book. I mean, I'm happy to take questions and definitely afterwards. But in this context, and actually a bit to my surprise, after I published the book, I was approached by a number of very wealthy people. I mean, so I interviewed some of them for the book that I reached out to, and I wanted to talk to them, and their input has been part of the stories in the book. But afterwards also there have been wealth holders that have wanted to talk to me. And actually this question, what should I do with my money, is one of the questions that they're asking me. They're asking me, not like they're going to follow exactly what I do, but they're really having this question in their mind. And what I've noticed is that also there are, of course, a lot of wealth holders who do things with their wealth. And they do very different things. And basically, I've noted that there's kind of two big groups. There's a group that is very enthusiastic about effective altruism, which is a view that I'm sure some of you already know very well, but I'll explain in a minute. And then there's a view that takes a much more, I would say, political attitude, a political approach. People like, I think most famously, in Austria, Marlene Engelhorn, who got a 2-digit million inheritance and then gave it away to a citizens' council to let them decide what to do with the money. And her argument was, this money is not mine, I should not have received it. Austria doesn't have inheritance taxation. I understand Sweden also doesn't have inheritance taxation, so that's interesting. So she basically said, I think the best way to interpret what she did was to make a political act out of giving away that inheritance to citizens to decide. But then the question is, the question is, there are these different approaches, because there's also wealth holders that I talk to that are completely in line with effective altruism, are actually funding effective altruism to become bigger. And the question I asked myself is, if I see what I have advised and what follows from my book in terms of advice, it's quite different than what effective altruism would advise or advises. So what should we make of these two answers? And that's what I want to talk with you about. So the plan for the presentation is that I'll first present you how effective altruism would answer the question what the rich should do with their wealth. Then I'll give you the answer to my question, which I gave a name just to not always say my answer. I think it's something like a political systemic analysis, because it's also absolutely not that I'm inventing something. I'm trying to distill something from what many people do. And then I want to compare them, and not surprisingly in that process I will defend the political systemic view over effective altruism, and then I'll draw some conclusions. So first, what is effective altruism? I'll just start with some definitions from what I think are the two main leading philosophers. Peter Singer, in this book, The Most Good You Can Do, says we should do the most good we can. That's basically what he thinks effective altruism stands for. And he then makes a distinction between what he thinks is a minimally acceptable ethical life, which involves, I quote, using a substantial part of our spare resources to make the world a better place. And resources could be money, but could also be time. And then a fully ethical life involves doing the most good, so maximizing. So that is the first thing to, I think, to point out, because the effective altruists complain that a lot of the people who criticize them make caricatures of what they say, and that's of course bad academic practice. So I've tried not to do that, and so in order to present them as charitable as possible, I think there are two things to note. One is they don't think doing good should be maximized, but also there's really a difference between effective altruist academic philosophers and the effective altruist movement. And I'm not a sociologist, so I can't say that I have 100% correct grasp of the movement. But what I have been doing to understand what the movement argues for, first of all, of course, I've been talking with these wealth holders that are endorsing effective altruism. I have read the books that the movement writes for ordinary people. And I've also joined one of the effective altruist introductory courses. And I've been reading up on their website, and I've been listening to endless podcasts that Singer and McCaskill have been giving just to the broader public. So that's, I think, and you see a difference. I mean, effective altruism as a movement is less pure or less radical, I think less demanding than effective altruism as a philosophy. That's how I think the distinction is. Now, McCaskill, in a 2019 paper where he tried to clarify this discussion, said effective altruism is, first, the use of evidence and careful reasoning to work out how to maximize the good with a given unit of resources. So first you have a given unit of resources, and then you see how you can maximize the good. Tentatively understanding the good in impartial welfarist terms. And then secondly, the use of these findings to improve the world. So the first is the analysis, and the second is then action. And now, what does this exactly mean? Let me then elaborate on what this means. Their answer would then imply that if you are wealthy, do the most good you can with the wealth that you can spare, that you are willing to allocate to doing good. And that is not everything you have. That is rather, they actually leave it very explicitly open to individuals to decide for themselves. Of course, they have the pledge and they have suggestions. But if you look, for example, at the effective altruism movement, something I found repeatedly is this idea of the 3 buckets. And these 3 buckets are basically how you divide your money. The first bucket is you allocate it to yourself, your own quality of life, your own desires and ambitions. Secondly, to others, where you have a personal reason to want to support them. So that means this is not impartial. They may be your children, or they may be a cause you really care about. And then the third bucket is where you try to give money impartially in welfarist terms to do with that money that you put in that third bucket maximally good. And they don't have a rule or how to divide it. They just say the more you could put in the third bucket, the better. But they are trying not to be explicitly, not to preach, not to moralize. They say, Singer says explicitly, we don't believe in guilt. So they don't want to go into all that area of moral philosophy. They just want to kind of make people enthusiastic to put as much money as possible in the third bucket. And then the third bucket is the effective is the one where they think you should apply effective altruism. That means in that third bucket, which is for impartial giving, to do maximally good, you have to be as effective as possible. So effectiveness really is the core criterion for those resources. And how do you decide what is effective? Well, you try to find, they have a number of suggestions on how to find causes that are effective. They have to be important causes, so not, for example, an example that I found that they see as somebody who's in that, a cause that is in the second bucket is trying to advocate for a political prisoner because it's just one person, whereas of course malaria, if you have whatever the number is, 600,000 people that die on a yearly basis, that's a large problem. So large problems, neglected problems, and then they should be tractable. You should know how you can actually solve the problem, or it should be at least you should have a strategy. And then what they say is you want to have a science-based method to find out what is more effective. And how do you do that? Ideally, you compare these different ways to reach that maximal good by looking at quantified scientific evidence. And the one that they discuss a lot are randomized control trials. So, I mean, this is a whole technical thing that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, but they try to, so for example, if you spend $100 on, well, say, paying the teacher's wage or $100 on deworming tablets, it turns out that if the goal is to keep children in school and let them learn, that deworming is much more effective than paying teachers' salaries. So these are the kind of effectiveness measures that they use. They do say that not every intervention can be measured. So they are, I think, in that sense, broader than. So this is an area where you could make a caricature of them. Importantly, they say that the third bucket should be a matter of impartiality. That means the welfare of every sentient being, living now, living in the future, human, non-human, is equally important. But it's also the only thing that counts. They're welfarist in the sense that they believe only the welfare, the suffering, and the happiness of sentient beings counts. And that is important for multiple reasons. One is that other creatures, such as trees, ecosystems are not creatures, but they contain creatures. Trees, ecosystems, but also things like biodiversity, do not have intrinsic value in themselves. To the extent that they affect the welfare of sentient creatures, they're relevant, but they're not intrinsically important. And that's one source of disagreement with part of the ecological movement. But the other one, which is where I strongly disagree with them, is that they think the only value that is relevant when deciding how to allocate our money is welfare. So they do not care in this respect about justice, freedom, non-domination, autonomy, any of them. They don't say that nobody should care about them. They're agnostic. Some of them take a personal stance and say, I only care about welfare. But they say, if you want to be effective, and if you want to do effective altruism, those other values do not count. In practice, most of the focus of the effective altruism movement is on the health of the global poor, or learning outcomes and so forth, on animals, not wild animals, but farm or factory animals, and on, increasingly now, also on existential risks, AI and nuclear catastrophes, and those things that would just basically wipe out all of us. So that's AI's answer. Now, what's the alternative view? So the alternative view that I actually did not really write down so neatly before coming here to give this presentation, I think is implicit in the analysis that I presented in my book. And the first assumption that I endorse is I endorse value pluralism. I think there are many values that have intrinsic worth, so in social and distributive justice, autonomy, non-domination, also epistemic justice, have also value in themselves. I mean,
Ingrid, could you just briefly explain some of those terms, like non-domination?
Yeah, non-domination may be a one that for philosophers is not, for non-philosophers is not evident. So non-domination is a concept of freedom, which means that, it literally says that you're not dominated by somebody else. And in the literature, the people who write on this are called Republican political thinkers. They would use, for example, as an argument that even if you have a master slave and the master is very good for the enslaved person and make sure that that person has very high welfare, actually that misses the point that the enslaved person is dominated, in the sense they're not free to live their own lives, and they are in that sense, so they're dominated, they can't have control over their own life. And the concept of domination is also used increasingly by these thinkers to analyze the economic system, which is important because I'll come back to that. Epistemic justice means that you take into account the knowledge of certain groups. For example, in healthcare, that doctors who are experts not just top-down say whatever needs to be done, but that they listen to the patients and that they take that knowledge into account, and also that certain groups are heard. So that is part of it is related to a view in epistemology, the literature on knowledge production, which is called standpoint epistemology, which means that those who have certain experiences with certain sufferings, so say the poor or those that are oppressed, actually have certain types of knowledge that are important in understanding what exactly is going on, but also what needs to be done. And epistemic justice is also, I think, absent in the work of effective altruism. So that is the first thing, value pluralism. I'm not going to defend it because otherwise I can speak for a long time. But so I just think you could argue in many different ways why these values are important. It's clear that if you talk to philosophers, they put different emphasis on different values, but we also have, for example, empirical studies that people actually value these things. So that would be one way of arguing for them. So that's the first normative assumption. The second is that if we are deciding what to do, hence what our actions are, I think we should focus on addressing the root causes of the low levels of these values. So if there is poverty and low levels of welfare, then you have to find out why is this, and then you can decide what to do. Similarly, if there is great injustice or domination, you have to know why this is the case. Then that leads to a methodological consequence, namely that if we want to address a problem, such as, say, suffering from the global poor, which is something that the effective altruists care about a lot, and I do too, then we, I think, need to understand its ultimate causes so that we can address this problem in a structural way. And that means that you need to be clear about your theory of change. How are you going to change the situation to improve the outcomes, whatever the outcomes are that you think are important? I mean, I'm not sure you need to have a full-blown theory of social change, but at least you need to be somewhat aware of what your theory of social change is. And I hope this is not unfair, but my the reading on effective altruism, I don't really think they have a theory of social change. Their theory of social change is they look at the symptoms of whatever has done in terms of harms, and then they're just going to address the symptoms directly, which is like if you give somebody an aspirin, but you don't know why they have a headache. Now, what are then the root causes? I will focus on poverty, because that's the area about which I know most, but also because I think it makes clearest where some of the differences are between the view that I would like to defend and the effective altruist view. What are the root causes of poverty and harmful and unjustified inequality, domination, and so forth? Well, I think really we need to look at social, economic, and political institutions at the local, the national, the transnational, and the global level, and how they interact. So and that means, I mean, this is abstract. I mean, this is of course what, say, political economists, people in development studies, what they work on all the time. I think that means that we must analyze the workings of contemporary global capitalism. There is no other way to understand what's happening if you don't analyze these things. So just to give one example, somebody like Ha-Yoon Chang, who is an economist at SOAS in London, has written books about how the development path that the rich countries took actually has then been denied to the poor countries because of the rules of the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. But that history is forgotten because modern day economics is a very different type of beast. It's much more modeling and much more building theories based on certain behavioral and also normative assumptions. And Chang says you have to look historically at what exactly happened, and then you can also see that as long as you don't change the rules of these IFIs, you're really not going to address this problem in a sustainable way. Now, I also think what is important is that many of these problems that we have in the Global South have historical aspects to which the Global North is connected. Just some examples. I mean, there are striking examples, but I think they make it clear. We have the governments and certain groups in the Global North have assassinated democratically elected leaders in the Global South. Allende is a famous case. Lumumba in the Congo is one of the richest in terms of natural resources countries in Africa. I'm actually Belgian from origin. When I studied in high school, we didn't hear anything about Lumumba. It was just like a rumor. But in the meantime, we know that the Belgians and the CIA together assassinated or made Lumumba being assassinated. And the reason was economic interests. So Belgium had, in Katanga, an area in the Congo, they had mines and they wanted to protect that. And they were worried that Lumumba would nationalize them. And basically take it out of the hands of the Belgian entrepreneurs. So there are really all these things that make that the analysis is really murky, and I'm definitely not saying, and I also don't believe this is true, that the development problems or the global poverty problems are entirely or mainly the causally traceable to actions in the global north. I'm not saying this. I actually don't know to what extent you can divide it up between decisions made now there and global rules. But it is to me evident, if you read up on the historical and the social science literature, development studies and so on, that that there is a role that we play. And that is important for the next thing I will say. I mean, another example is the UN Security Council. Countries from the Global South keep saying we should change this and nothing happens. Why? Because the Global North and China do not want it. Actually, it's not just that in the Global South, the economic system is has a role in explaining outcomes. It's also the case in the Global North. Because, and that's where I write about a lot in this book, we have had a shift from social democracies to what we could call neoliberal capitalism. If the word neoliberalism triggers in you an irritation, as I know it does to some people, then just replace it with contemporary capitalism. The word doesn't mean, I mean, it's a scholarly term. There are handbooks of more than 1,000 pages written on neoliberalism. So it's not a swear word, as some people want to make it out. And we can explain what it has done, but just very briefly, some of the things we've seen is that the effective taxation rates in almost all the countries have become less progressive. Actually, they are now regressive. The richest pay less percentage-wise than the middle classes. And we've seen rising wealth inequalities. That comes with all sorts of harms. That's what I've written about in this book. We see that democracy is under pressure. That is actually related to the cuts in, say, welfare states provisions, because analysis by political scientists shows that one of the reasons why there's an increase in people voting for extreme right parties is because they feel less secure because their basic welfare state provisions have been cut. And I think also very important, I think our governments have weakened. I mean, in multiple ways. One is that public wealth has become much smaller than private wealth. That's in the work of Piketty. But also the whole narrative has really changed, that our governments are incapable. They're incapable of solving problems. They are, public choice theory has told us that they're always self-serving. And of course, I'm not saying that I actually do think we have a lot of governments that have a lot of really big problems, but it is like a vicious circle that has developed over the last decades, which in part has been fueled by this narrative that actually business is much better capable of solving problems than the government, and that is really one of the most important neoliberal assumptions that also influences the very wealthy who want to give away their money, because they think we shouldn't look at the government, we shouldn't argue for increased taxations. Instead, let the business owners, the entrepreneurs, let them address these problems. Now, what is then the theory of change that I think I'm sketching this. I haven't worked this out, but this is, I think, what implicitly is in the views that I hold. I think change happens by putting pressure on that what we want to let go and making room for that what we want to replace with. If anybody here is from transition studies, which is a field, you will have heard of the X curve, and the X curve basically just means I don't have a whiteboard here, but the one side of the X goes down. That's the system that's dominant, and you want it to go down. But there's another system that is latent, and you want it to go up. That's why you have an X. And how can you do that transition? Well, by critiquing the one that's dominant and that you want to go down, by showing its flaws, by, if it's powerful, by taking it to court. Think of any company or any organization that doesn't work within the Paris Climate Agreement. But you also have to build the narrative and examine and show how an alternative is possible and how that would look like. And it's not just desk work, it means you have to do experiments in society and then see whether they're scalable. So what do I think we need to do? We need to disarm those that are doing bad or evil, because these groups do exist. I mean, I discuss a number of them in my book, but I think the continuous strong lobby of the fossil fuel industry to keep on digging, to use all the reserves they have is, I think, an example. We need good, well-functioning, accountable governments. So that means we really need to work on the quality of the government. Why? Because otherwise we may come up with all sorts of policies, but we don't have the agents to execute them and to implement them. This again implies we need stronger democracies, which means we need to embrace our role as citizens. And one of the cultural things that has come with the neoliberal wave or change is that our economic roles have always been stressed. So we have neoliberalism regards everything through the lens of economic roles. We are, of course, we have our private role as individuals and husbands, wives, parents, whatever you want. That's private. And then you have our economic roles, which is we're workers, we're entrepreneurs, we're investors. We are no longer saying we are students and we're going to find out what we want to do with life. Instead, we are now human capital builders. So that economic focus has pushed out a third pillar, which we know all the way back from Aristotle, which is citizenship. And for example, our relation to the state has increasingly become one of, we see ourselves as clients to the services that the state provides, rather than citizens who have certain rights or are also having to play a certain constitutive role in good functioning of democracy. And that is, I think, very important to stress that role of citizens. And then finally, that also means it's not just about policies or actions or new technology development. It is also about changing the narratives, changing how we see ourselves, how we see each other, how we see the government, and so forth. And scholars would call this ideology, but some people think ideology is a pejorative term, so another word could be the public narrative. Whichever you want. I really don't, I'm happy with whatever word people like to use. Given all of this, what then would I say to the rich who say, what should I do with my money? The first thing I would say, this is much, there's 8 things, which is much longer than what the effective altruists would say. But I would say the first thing we need to do, if we happen to be very rich, is ask, are principles of reparative justice applicable to my wealth? Do I have wealth that's actually stained? Do I have wealth that I have inherited from my ancestors? About half of wealth, actually, big amounts of wealth are inherited, or and that has been stained because of the transatlantic slave trade, or because of that it was tied to Nazi atrocities, or more recently that it was actually tied to illicit tax flows or tax evasion, or to illicit tax practices and so forth. And there are actually examples of both individuals, families, companies, universities that have looked into their past and have commissioned from historians studies to try to find out to what extent is our wealth tainted to immoral practices, and have then engaged in processes of reparation. That's the first. The second is, if you are creating your wealth, the wealth you have comes from entrepreneurship or investments, I think the question is, are you doing good in your company? So are you, because, so for example, Jeff Bezos is, I think is a good example for who should apply the second rule. He is sometimes applauded for the fact that more than the other people in the top 10 of the billionaires list, he is giving to philanthropy, he's given to environmental causes, he's setting up Bezos schools and so forth. But he has himself said when he went to space, thanks to my employees, because it's thanks to you that we could do this. And of course, the question about how in a capitalist system where workers and entrepreneurs together produce the, I mean, Rawls would say the social product, but basically the profits. How do you divide that between those that bring in the capital and those that bring in the labor is a question you have to ask. And there again, we know from empirical work by economists and historians, that the division between what capital gets and what labor gets has become much less favorable to labor over time. So the so-called capital share has gone up and the labor share has gone down. So I think that's an important thing. So I actually was giving a training to wealth advisors a couple of weeks ago, and somebody, after I gave my talk, a different talk than this one, asked, okay, so tomorrow I'm having an advisory meeting with a company who actually has made 2 million profit this year, and they are asking me what to do with it. And then we had a discussion in that group, like, what could that person advise? And somebody also said, well, first of all, ask whether your employees actually are having decent working conditions and decent wages. And then, of course, there's always this dialectic that people say, yeah, but we can't increase wages because that's a long-term thing. But you could give them a bonus. You could give them a one-off bonus. We do that with CEOs too. So there is, I think, that's the first thing to think about. Third, I think there's those that do systemic harm. We should either fight them if you, for example, have legal capacities, or you're a fighting character, or you could fund to fight them. So, and there are many different ways in which this goes. So, for example, there is in the Netherlands this organization called Follow This. They buy shares in all the oil companies, and then they go to the annual meetings and they submit resolutions to keep the oil in the ground. And so basically that's their strategy. I mean, you can debate whether that's an effective strategy, but there's also, of course, all the environmental companies that take them to court. So those organizations need money, especially because they're often sued by those, or they get retaliated by those fossil companies that have, of course, immense amounts of money to do this. And so that means it's important to fund those that are fighting those that do harm. Fourth, I do think, as I explained, we need not just fight what we want to get rid of, but we also need to make space and investigate the alternatives. So I do think that those who are working on alternatives say, I mean, I know less about this world, but say certain types of alternative companies like yes, cooperatives, but there's already a lot of that done. But there's this new wave of thinking about now I forgot the name, but where you take all the stakeholders into account, and actually the mission of the company is to serve the purpose and not to. So basically, you could say there's still another. There's still another one. I will find it. I'll tell you. I'll be able to tell you later. But in any case, any sort of company model that's not profit maximizing, or that's not if you have shareholder maximizing, we need to have those experiments because we also have to see whether they scale up, what it does with happiness of everybody involved, with the quality of the products and so on. But also think of energy cooperatives or of care cooperatives. We need to have more information on how well those things are working, and also of all sorts of things. And I'm guessing also you could say all the experiments with direct democracy, the citizens' assemblies need to be much better studied to see whether what they would advise as policies would be, how that would work in the ecosystem of democratic institutions. I also think we need to fund those that are showing how that are not just doing the experiments on the ground, but that are tying it together, that are really building, you could say, a new vision of an economy or a socioeconomic system. Because if you think about, say, the history of social democracy, of course, where Sweden was a front runner, it has come with on-the-ground struggles by, say, unions and workers and so on. But there's also always the wave of intellectual support and strategic thinking, and those you need both of them. And we've actually seen that the neoliberal change came first from the high level, from the thinkers. So there has been a wave of intellectuals. I mean, the most famous ones are Friedrich von Hayek, Milton Friedman, and so on, that already from the late 30s started to debate this kind of views. And then, of course, they've become most famously in 1947 when they founded the Mont Pelerin Society. And then it accelerated because they were backed up by funders. But that is a historical example that I think is still relevant. But you also have, for example, the Koch brothers, industrialists in the US, that have organized the Koch seminars, where they brought together people that were really trained and build networks to then roll out a certain strategy. And that is something that I think those who want to have a more sustainable, human-oriented economy do not have. At least I do not see it. I know there's some sort of examples, but they're weak and they're not properly funded. And then I think, let me see what else is here. Oh yes, and the seventh one is, of course, and then there's democracy, but then the seventh one is I also think we should support those who are fighting for their own human rights. And here, an example is what Mackenzie Scott did, the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos. When she divorced him, she was given, or she negotiated, I can't remember exactly, but something like 260 or 200 something billion dollars. And she then wrote a piece, which you can find online on Medium, and she said, this money goes back to society which generated it. So her theory of where this money comes was already kind of very, you could say, Rawlsian, like we do this all together. And she said, I'm going to give it away until the coffin is empty. Well, she's not managing that because her wealth is growing faster than what she gives away, even though she is one of the most generous person giving it away. And what she does is, so that actually tells us something about how fast, if you have lots of wealth, how fast it accumulates. She gives it to groups that have been in the front line of fighting for justice and human rights for a long time. And what's interesting is she doesn't ask them for a plan. She doesn't ask them for, prove me that what you're going to do is effective. She trusts them that because of their epistemic position, they know what they need to do. And that is completely opposite to what the effective altruists would advise, because they would want to have proof to the extent that we can that what they will do is effective. And then I do want to say, in agreement with the effective altruists, that of course we should try to be as effective as possible when we do those things. There's no point in trying to do stuff that is not effective, but the goals would be different. Okay, now let me then, as a last part, compare effective altruism and the view that I have proposed. So I do think effective altruism would not recommend any of my recommendations to the wealthy. Why? Because first of all, they would say only welfare counts, or they would say it's the only value on which effective altruism has anything to say. But the problem with this answer, which they've given in response to critique to those who say that they don't care about, say, justice, is that if you do action guiding, if you say what has to be done, and you leave out part of the analysis, you can't do that you can't do action guiding if your analysis is not comprehensive. So you either have to say, only welfare counts, and here's my effective altruist advice, or you say all these values count, we have to deliberate and decide how much they count, and then we will have a different kind of strategy. I think, as I already mentioned, that the theory of change in effective altruism, although they have, to the best of my knowledge, not written about this, is to cure the symptoms of the problems of our socioeconomic systems. They do say things like they're consequentialists, so they do say we're looking to the future. We want to address things. So there are some nods to this in their writing. So, but that means that, for example, they can't understand or appreciate the importance of reparative justice. They would say, well, do whatever maximizes welfare. And I also think they can't see a relevant distinction between a private person distributing vaccines or the WHO or a local government, except if they would have a theory how in the long run this would also affect welfare. I think effective altruism overwhelmingly, not entirely, but overwhelmingly, understands a scientific approach to be quantitative empirical research. And especially what I find striking reading up on what they say both in scholarly papers, but also say the organization that does this work, or the organization it was called until last year Open Philanthropy, that does a lot of their grant giving, they've now changed their names, is they do acknowledge that some problems cannot be assessed by these randomized control trials, but you just feel from the whole body of arguments this need to quantify, and I am increasingly thinking, also listening to all these podcasts by the main leaders, I am very, very wary to psychologize. I think that is, you should always be very careful to do that. But it's almost as if it gives them security, like a sort of epistemic security that they have black and white on paper that what they're going to do is the best. But the world is not like that. The world is messy. There are multiple things. I agree that we have to be rational and reasonable when we make decisions, but I just don't think, given everything I've said about how these problems come along, that you can do that for all problems in this way. There are, of course, very narrow problems where this can be applied, and then I think they're right in looking at what works. So I was, for example, very happy to read in all these studies that direct giving is so effective, because from my perspective, which is I care about welfare a lot, but also about these other things, it actually also addresses a lot of these other questions. It addresses non-domination, it strengthens democracies, and so forth. So, and then I think why effective altruism has a very different approach is because it's consequentialist, it's forward-looking, it doesn't look for ultimate causes, it doesn't ask who's responsible. Now, what would the effective altruists say? They're going to defend themselves clearly, because they always say that their critics are uncharitable or have misunderstood them. McCaskill writes in 2019, "It's a misconception that effective altruism ignores system change. It's clear that effective altruism is open to systemic change in principle. Effective altruism is committed to cause neutrality." That means you can work for different causes, whether it's health or education or AI safety, and it means neutrality. So you can decide to change your job to get the higher welfare or give money. So if improving the world in some systemic way is the course of action that will do most good, then it's the best source of action. Then it's the best source of action that by effective altruists light. And then he gives a number of examples. I found this list of examples absolutely not convincing. Some of them are question begging. I mean, I actually didn't bring his book, but I mean, I'm happy to defend that on another occasion. I just didn't think this was very convincing at all. The list is also very short, and it doesn't look at issues of poverty. The only one that I actually thought was very interesting and striking was arguments for bigger labor mobility, so basically open borders. That is a really systemic issue, but it's again, none of the examples were about the economic system. He also says campaigning to change a structure of the global economic. He says about campaigning to change a structure of the global economic system that the chance of success is, I quote, astronomically low, and therefore, even in the best case scenario, the legal change would occur decades. Hence, the problem of extreme poverty will probably be far smaller and less severe than today. Now, I don't find this a convincing response. First of all, because I don't think only poverty counts. There's also justice, non-domination, and other harms. Secondly, you may think I don't understand how you can believe that poverty will be sustainably eradicated if you don't address the root causes. Now, if we were to have a discussion about the root causes, we may disagree about what the root causes are. The effective altruist may say to me, well, you and all your friends in development studies and so on, you're wrong. Actually, the main cause is, I'm guessing, technology or human capital, they would say. I'm guessing if they would say something. But at least you would need something that's sustainable, because otherwise you will keep on addressing symptoms. And what I found striking is that there is in all the work and all the literature just such a lack of scholarly knowledge of how system change is possible. If you think at the abolishment of slavery, if you think at labor rights, decolonialization, women's rights, social rights and social movement, we have made all those gains. We have accounts of how that happened. So it's not impossible, but you have to study the historians and all those scholars to know how that's possible. You could, I'm trying to be, again, I hope I'm saying this honestly, but I'm trying to be as charitable to them as I can, and if you think I'm not, you should tell me. But let us assume that we take them as a method, purely as a method, and we ask, what is a scientifically based way of inquiring how to do more good or most good? Then I think effective altruism actually might come up with the answers that I've given, or at least they would include them. But the thing is, effective altruism has access to massive resources. They shift billions a year. And most of the systemic critiques on effective altruism were already raised by 2015. So that's 11 years ago. If 11 years later, almost nothing has happened on this account, and when you press them, they will only point to a few marginal interventions, and they have literally zero criticism on contemporary capitalism. In fact, Singer is actually lukewarmly positive towards contemporary capitalism. And you see nothing in that movement, looking at those questions, then I really think this is a case of willful negligence. They do not want to change the system. And that also might be an hypothesis for why so many billionaires like them, I need to end, thank you. Why so many billionaires like them? Because they don't question the system. Okay, very briefly, I should stress on a positive note. I think effective altruism is absolutely correct that many people in the world have many financial resources that would be better allocated elsewhere. I think welfareism is wrong as a theory of value in the social and political world. I think effective altruism is by and large apolitical and there's a typo here, asystemic. Its theory has the potential to be broader, but its leaders choose not to do so. I think the leaders are ignorant about the importance of socioeconomic institutions and system for sustainable poverty reduction, and also for other values such as justice and non-dominations, and hence I think wealth holders would be advised to take transformative actions more in line with what I presented rather than following effective altruism's advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure it's going to be many questions. As usual, we have an audience online and an audience in person. If you're here in person, raise your hand. If you have a new question, raise a finger for a follow-up. And if you're online, use this Zoom chat to submit your question, and also include your name and area of study, because we like to file questions from different disciplines. So you can write your name and then if you have a hand, or you write follow-up if you have a follow-up. And with that said, let me start by asking you a question, taking the opportunity of doing that. I'm not going to question your sociological analysis of effective altruist, but I wonder how big the gap is between you and effective altruist. I mean, you said incorrectly, I think, that they don't care about non-domination and social justice thing. That you said in the beginning, but you actually changed that later on, because they do care about it as an instrumental value.
Yeah. But so not as an intrinsic value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not so unreasonable. I mean, as you make it up. I mean, You have many. You can take some kind of perhaps a little bit more well-read, because I agree, utilitarians like Bob Goodin has very clearly know all these things and have been discussing for a long time how you look at these different things. And your sociological critique can still be true, but still there's clearly, very arcane questions whether you should only care about welfare, which, by the way, you gave a little bit of a caricature there, because they don't need to be hedonists, of course. They can be think that welfare, you also care about that people get what you want and that they get objectively good things and all that. Of course, the more kind of refined there. So the hedonist part, I think, is just a non sequitur that they should be hedonists.
They defend that in what they say and in what they write.
Yeah, but I mean, absolutely, they care about welfare. And then,
Yeah.
of course, no one thinks that we're going to solve this problem, what is the right theory of welfare, by just assuming it. They can have much broader there. So in that sense, I'm a bit unsure in the first part whether there's still a little bit of a character. And take this to give you an example. It's not so strange to have you. Okay, I care about non-domination because I think it makes people's life go better welfare. So let's say you have a trade-off. You either have a case where people are a little bit less dominated, but they are much more unhappy. Or you have a case where they're a little bit more dominant, but they are happier, they get more of what they want, and they get objective things. There's nothing strange with saying that, okay, I actually go for that.
But you would have to have the debate. And the problem is, if you don't...
I don't disagree with the sociological part. I agree at all that they should read more.
No, we're talking about theory now.
Right.
But the thing is, I just don't see how... I think there are really big problems if you reduce all these other values to an instrumental role to welfare. And I know I was warned, if I were to come here, I would get that comment. But this is like, we've had like... decades of arguments why these values have intrinsic worth. I mean, John Rawls.
And I think they're all wrong, actually.
Yeah, but
and many people think, but I don't think it matters so much.
No, I do think it does matter. It does really matter.
How does it matter so much? Oh, I really fight for non-domination because I think it's good for people's well-being. Or I really fight for non-domination because I believe it has value in itself. You're gonna get to the same conclusion. So it doesn't matter from a political perspective, I think. What is the argument that it matters from a political perspective?
Well, the argument is that I think we can have... first of all, I think the argument, at the level of value theory, is that... But there are parts who then really depart. That these other values have worth in themselves. And I would say I found it interesting that this is... if you were to... I know that in ethics... You can, and if you're utilitarian, you can defend welfarism as the only thing that ultimately counts. But the whole of political philosophy has all these other values.
We all agree with them, but they are instrumental values.
Yeah, Gustav, we can stay here for another hour. But so I think then the proof of the pudding is in the examples. So let us look at examples. Of course, the Republicans would say, oh, well, but the happy slave is still dominated. And the welfarists would say, well, he's happy. So he might actually, if you liberate him, he might become less unhappy because he's never known, he might become more unhappy because he's never known such a system where he is a free person.
You need some empirical evidence for that. And
yes.
That's pretty weak.
Well, but the thing is, if you talk about empirical evidence, in welfare economics, when I studied welfare economics, there was the growth or the emergence of non-welfarist welfare economics. They did empirical work and they illustrated and demonstrated that welfarism is not all that matters to people.
Exactly. And that's for welfare, it's important that you get what you want. Since it matters to people, that's why it comes into welfare.
Yeah, but then of course, if you say all the other values are things that people want, so all the values become part of the preferences. And then you define welfare as how people can meet their preferences. Yes, of course, but then...
Not only preference and happiness and getting objective goods. But anyway, we should let other people...
Yeah, but that is absolutely not how effective altruists describe their own work. There is a way to rescue this, just like you can consequentialize everything. Actually, I should say, in my faculty, I'm seen as the consequentialist. So it's funny here to be... yes.
I find you very consequentialist.
Yeah.
I like that.
Anyway, yeah.
A microphone.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just one quick follow-up on that exchange that you and Gustav just had. If you reject welfarism and you want to be a pluralist and have more, other kinds of values, I think that's fine. But I think any plausible pluralism is going to have welfare on the list. I mean, you don't
Yes.
want to like completely ignore and then if you have
Absolutely.
welfare on the list, then those kinds of trade-off questions that Gustav was talking about are kind of inevitable. But that's just a minor
I
point.
agree with all of that.
Okay, but the thing I wanted to kind of push you on is the need to quantify. So toward the end of your talk, you suggested, you know, people in the effective altruism have this. It's almost like a need to want to quantify everything, and there are some things that just can't be quantified. That might be right, but I think having some kind of quantitative framework, some kind of quantitative proxies for the values that you mentioned, like non-domination and justice, might be more important than you suggested at the end of your talk. One reason why it's important is because, first of all, I think you can probably, I don't think you should give up on the idea that you can have quantitative proxies for those values. And there are, you know, we have like the Human Development Index and like people who are trying to quantify not, you know, things other than welfare. Those might be very important, not only because you can do it, but also because it helps donors formulate a plan. It gives them better advice about how to spend their money, right? If you want to advise donors and all you give them is your list 1 through 8 that you put up there, I don't think that's going to help very much. I mean, it might help me start to, you know, to look at places, but once I do the looking and I realize that there are lots of organizations that are fighting those who do systemic harm, and there are lots of, organizations that are trying to strengthen democracy, et cetera, it just still doesn't tell me how to spend my money. Whereas if you had a quantitative proxy for the different values and you kind of started with that, you would be able to give much better advice. And that might take time, right? It might take time to set up a non-welfarist version of GiveWell, you know, or some of the organizations that effective altruism focuses on. But it's a project worth doing, I think.
Yes, thank you. This is a very, very interesting comment/question. So I'm in the project I'm currently doing with a team. We are trying to compare. I mean, this is like really very, very early work, but we're trying to compare the value scores of different economic systems. And there are people who've written about, I mean, I think, for example, so there's work by Joe Heath or Harry Brickhouse about actually responding to critics of capitalism, saying, look, you can't just say we will have more justice under whatever they argue. Typically, they argue for socialism, whatever that then is. You have to really look at all the values. And Heath, of course, given his commitments, thinks welfare is very important, and I think he's completely right. We are now struggling with the fact, actually, exactly as you say, how could you quantify them? I'm thinking you can probably give them some sort of, you can, if you have one system, you can probably, or you compare different systems on one of those values, you can probably you give ordinary rankings. Quantifying, you know, I'm just worried that we get, if we want to quantify in a cardinal way, we're going to give numbers or what an index like the Human Development Index. We're going to make so many simplifications that actually are harmful. And I should say it's interesting that you mentioned the Human Development Index, because I did a lot of work, like 20 years, on the capability approach, which is one of the foundations of the Human Development Index. And although I think there's lots of normative and other types of reasons to take that multidimensional framework, it is very hard to quantify. Also because capabilities are opportunities rather than outcomes. There's tricks and you can make simplifications. My position would probably be quantify if you can, but keep the narrative. And I should say that if you, for example, look at the Open Philanthropy Foundation, which is now it has a different name, Coefficient Foundation, I think it's called. They do say that there's all these things that they can't quantify, and typically they can't quantify either systems or those things, or what Singer also says is they can't assess organizations that work on many different goals at the same time, typically Oxfam and those. And that is, I think, that is difficult. So I am actually more in term. I think I would favor an approach that puts the quantitative elements in a broader reasoning. Now, I do want to say, when you said your list is not going to be very helpful for the
As helpful as it.
yes, but look, this is it's true, but it's also kind of not okay, I'll say two things. One is I then point them to organizations where they can actually go in a trajectory that take this approach. Example, the Good Ancestor movement in London. Second, I'm one person who has written this this PowerPoint. The effective altruists, when Toby Ord and Will McCaskill came up with this idea, we need to find out what's most effective, they also had something at the back of an envelope. In the meantime, they have had billions and billions of money, and they actually say so repeatedly that I don't know how many tens of thousands of hours went into those calculations. So the question is really, which billionaire will fund this research project? That's then the question, because we can't compare them, because you're comparing somebody with zero resources with an enormous machinery, which is the effective altruism movement.
One thing I will say is they put many hours into that research well before there were millions of dollars in effective altruism. It's true that the money later helped with the research, but the research can proceed without the money. It may not be as good.
Yes, but then you have to again, because we have research on, say, I mean, I think you're now talking about the research that uses QALYs and DALYs and so forth, right? And because that builds on a literature. But if you want to, say, compare economic systems, which is the work I'm doing now with my team, it's like scattered. It's like the quality of the literature, I think, is not very good. Especially if you want to do anything that is comprehensive, which I think is we really should try.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Marcus.
Okay, thanks. This is very interesting. I guess this is a version of Gustav's question, and it's about how like the status of your critique and how it could be accommodated by EA as a movement, I guess. So, so one of the responses from the effective altruists to the earlier institutional critique, as it's sometimes called, is to just try and take it on board, right? So they could try to say this is all right, and we thank you for your contribution in informing us about what's really at stake here, and then they try to sort of diffuse the criticism by incorporating it. And you touched on that towards the end of your talk, but I wonder, is that a reasonable response here, and also what does it say about your purpose with this project? So, I mean, how much of effective altruism could change and sort of incorporate your points here and still remain effective altruism? And also how much of your, what would happen to your critique if everything was incorporated into the movement and they accepted everything you said? Would it still be a critique? And does it really matter? Because it seems to me like what you're really interested in is trying to change what very wealthy people do with their money.
Absolutely.
And not really quarreling with effective altruists about what the core philosophy of their movement is. Right? So in a counterfactual world where these people didn't read Peter Singer in grad school, but they read your books instead, and you became the intellectual leader of this movement, and they followed all of these ideas. I mean, so what does that sort of counterfactual scenario tell us about how to think about your
thank you. This is interesting. So of course, so the funny thing is that actually I think I haven't checked it, but I think in the book that I wrote on the problems with extreme wealth, I think I have like a tiny comment on effective altruism, and for the rest I endorse them. So I actually, and I know also that they get criticized very strongly. And for example, David Edmonds has just written a book where he just says like, why are these good people who are trying to do so much good so strongly criticized? So I understand that. but that is not what we want, because you want everybody who are like want to shift the money to be allied and work together. But for me, the real issue is your solution structural or is it not? And is it addressing the root cause of the problem or not? And then here I disagree with the welfareists in the room. Is it really also doing full justice to these other values or not? But I think I try. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong. These are my backup. I don't. Yeah, I just want to show you. So this is what I tried to do on the last slide, and I'm sorry it was the presentation was too long. I actually do think that if you see effective altruism as a method, namely to try to use reason rather than emotion, also count for the fact that we have these 3 buckets. So you don't want to go with the case where you can't give by, say, you have a disabled child, you can't do anything for them because you could. So that actually, I think, weakens the impartiality claim, which I think makes it much more swallowable for many of us who believe that we have particular duties to some people. And if you then were to accept that that you can only that you have to be very careful when you quantify, that you don't leave out normatively important considerations. If you were to do that as the method, then I think my hunch is they would then indeed have to broaden what they do and take on board these structural things. This is pure speculation. So I think my intuition here is that the reason why you have to address these problems in a structural way and go to the root causes is for 2 reasons. One is because you want the solutions to be sustainable, in the sense that stable. You don't want to every year go and bring vaccines from the global north to the global south. You want to make sure that the basic structure in those countries is solid, so that those governments can do that to their citizens and to the children, which means, for example, you would have to change the international global structure, the trade rules and the rules of the international financial institutions. That is an assumption that of course you could say, perhaps if you do all these methods of these effective altruism, in the end something stable will roll out. I don't see how that would work. I think you really need to change the rules of the game, and I don't see them doing enough to change the rules of the game. They do some, that needs to be said. And then the question still remains whether you would address injustices. So I think even if it's not the most effective, we should pay reparations in case we have enslaved people. And not because of their welfare that will go up, which will happen, but because as a matter of reparatory justice. And then yes, we may come to agree, but that I found so sad that you're right, institutional critique. I mean, most of the papers are from 2015, and they do. I mean, the podcasts which are from the last years, but also the paper from McCaskill from 2019. I found his section where he says misconception AI cannot deal with systemic issues. I found it completely not convincing. And then there is the question about capitalism. McCaskill has, to the extent that I know, not written about capitalism. Singer, in what he's read, he's like lukewarm in favor, and I've tried to have a conversation with him about it, and yeah, he's in line with the view that capitalism has led to the most reduction of the number of poor people, which if you take Our World in Data is true. But I've written a lot about this in the book, that this is too simplistic. There's historians who say you have to look much further, and then it becomes much murkier. Sometimes it's also there's not a clear conclusion to draw, and that we just must accept them.
Thanks.
Katarina.
Yes, thank you. This was very interesting and very inspiring. I wanted to ask you something about this list of things that the very wealthy should do with their money, and specifically about item 6 on that list, which you almost didn't mention.
Yeah.
So strengthening democracy or funding those who strengthen democracy. And I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about that point, specifically in light of this kind of institutional critique that has been leveraged against the effective altruism movement, that their focus is basically on individualized solutions to systemic problems. And that in light of this critique, I think we have to acknowledge that strengthening democracy means, importantly, also strengthening the people's power over the distribution of resources, of money. And that, of course, entails weakening the very wealthy's power over these resources. And this would, of course, mean that they would have to work towards taking the decision who to fund out of their own hands, right? And giving it back to the governments. Or the collective, so the people, giving back to the people. So that would mean, like, more specifically, that they, on the list, should be specifically that they should also speak out for higher taxes, and that they should pressure their peers, their very wealthy peers, to do the same, pressure governments to tax them more. And so I just wanted to invite you on this point, because it's not related directly to what they should do with their money, but indirectly how that money should be handled.
So I basically agree with everything you've said, and I mean, I write about this a lot in the book. That I have a chapter that's called "Philanthropy is not the solution." It's like almost a paradox. On the one hand, I think in an ideal world, in an ideal world in which we have a really properly functioning government, which actually is a question whether that's fully reliable, accountable, and so forth government, I'm not sure whether that's actually achievable. It may be an ideal. So, but suppose you have that, you might not. I think you actually don't need philanthropy, except, not philanthropy for basic needs, but of course you might have an argument for philanthropy as a kind of a counterbalance. But you're right that the thing is really about tax justice. And what's interesting is, I came, as I said, to this talk because of this book, and then I got in touch with all these people who do these different things, and the ones that actually are not doing what the effective altruists advise, but are doing what I've tried to reconstruct here, they tend to almost all work on tax justice. So the Patriotic Millionaires, which is an American group that also has an international UK wing, they work on 3 different things. One is tax justice. The other one is affordability, proper minimum incomes, and the third one is to keep the influence of money out of politics. But you have also the German-speaking group, Tax Me Now, and there's others, and they all work on tax justice. But that means you have a view of how society should run, and that is, of course, also. I don't see that view in the writing of effective altruists.
Yeah, sure. I just think that this should maybe go on the top of the list.
Okay.
Maybe that's too off-putting.
I'll consider that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Very good. Then we go to maybe the cause of all the problems, the former supervisor of Wind McCaskill, Christer Byqvist.
Thank you for that.
Thanks for disclosing this.
Well, we also co-authored the book, actually, with Toby as well. So I'm deeply sort of tainted by this. I'm not actually myself part of the effective altruist movement.
It's never too late.
So, no. No, I was just trying to figure out, actually, other people too have been figuring out exactly what is the critique. Obviously, there are a lot of things to say about whether they are following the principles, whether they have the necessary knowledge to apply the principles, where the heart really is. Actually, they say this is the principle, but do you really put much weight on it and so on? And also the financial part of it, the organization, right? The billionaire sets the agenda, research agenda. That's not very good, is it? So all that stuff, I think, I agree fully, right? And I think That's also kind of a structural critique, but critiquing the structure of effective altruism rather than the principles, right? Because I think, as Gustav and other people are saying, if welfare includes not being dominated, right? Not being unfairly treated and so on, right? Which some people have been, quite a few people in political philosophy too, have been flirting with. Then, and you say, consider effectiveness of value creation. Well-being is one of the values. Better be effective. You get pretty close to their fundamental principles, right? But of course, you think they perhaps do not have the right knowledge about social change. They need that, perhaps. They don't have a vague understanding, should do more research on that. Good. Something you can tell them, talk about, right? Or the founders, at least, that they should have an eye on that. And also the democracy strengthening should be something that you should really think about. Because they, as you say, they are not against systemic sort of options. In fact, Benjamin Todd, in his blogs, talks a lot about the fact that we have working hard on animal welfare, and that's been structural, right? About structural legislation and so on. Of course, Peter Singer as well earlier did that. And also they're quite clear about the ends do not justify the means, right? So justice can constrain the promotion of well-being. So Benjamin Todd, one of the founders of effective altruism, is very clear about that. Right? So I think, and you agree, right? You agree that well-being is one notion, one important value. It's not just hedonistically defined, right? And there's important justice elements too that constrains the promotion of well-being. But now we need a good theory of social change so we can select the most effective means, right? So why not just collaborate on that rather than sort of try to sort of pick fights with them?
Yeah, no.
Of course, you're not actually disagreement with their fundamental principles as they present them. And I agree, they might not, perhaps they are, perhaps utilitarians at, deep down at heart, perhaps, right? So officially they have this effective altruism principle. But I think that's different for different people in the movement. Think about Roger Crisp and Theron Palmer, who actually has a spin-off thing about effective justice, right? So they're trying to actually develop, influenced by effective altruism, a view about effective value creation when it comes to justice, right? And I think that's exactly a good thing to do, right? And you could do the same thing with social chains and non-domination, right?
Yeah.
Effective non-domination is something we need, right?
Yeah.
Building on historical knowledge, as you say, right?
Okay, but then the question is to what extent I accept their framework or they accept my framework, because I really don't think it is in their framework now. So I mean, I don't. So I think it would be good to have the people who stand for this kind of approach and the effective altruism to sit in a room and really go. I mean, I like the Amartya Sen has this method called case implication critique, which is to go through cases and just test on cases how you would handle them and then see how they differ. Because you're right that when they talk about animal welfare, they of course that's most of the work is lobbying. Lobbying is political, but I have really not seen it on political on the poverty issues, and also I wonder whether they could really endorse the kind of method that led to this list, because they would have to, I wonder to what extent they would agree, firstly, that you need to have a structural analysis of the causes. I mean, they really say in their writings, you have to look forward, we have to be problem-oriented, and I don't see it. But of course, there are, like, if you go to the Effective Altruism Forum, it's like, I said to a colleague the other day, I'm very deep down the rabbit hole of because it just goes on and on and on. I cannot say for sure that I've read everything. So no, because it's impossible. There's just so much that they're so big. But I mean, it would be, I've actually been thinking, because I'm actually not, first of all, I should say, I'm not interested in critiquing them for the sake of critiquing them. I don't have any feelings towards them. I just came to this question because these rich people asked me this, and this was what based on my work and everything I've been doing over the last 30 years, what I thought was the reasonable answer. And I've also noticed that the people who seem to be in this stream of working, several of them really are very, have strong antipathy towards effective altruism. So I'm trying to understand, do they have a basis for this antipathy, or is there really a difference? And so, yeah, I think I'm not sure. It would really require them to do work very differently. Yeah.
Or another supervisor.
What?
It's a supervisor problem. You should work a bit
No,
different,
no, but so, and I should say there's one other thought. I agree with you that there's a question about the principle, but when I was writing this paper, was reminded when I was working on the capability approach like 20 years ago, and one of the arguments of the capability approach is you don't have to look at resources, but what people can do with the resources. And I wrote a paper, and I was at the time, because my PhD is actually formally, but also half in practice in economics, I sent this to somebody and they said, no, we can do this. Here's a paper, one paper. And that is, of course, I mean, yes, there's always somewhere an exception. So I do think that what you guys call the sociological critique is maybe more important than we philosophers tend to think. It's not about can your framework accommodate it, but also do you really do it?
I think we agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
Completely.
Okay.
That's where the big move is.
Yeah.
Not the thing in before. Very good. Henrik.
Yeah, I had a question about the quote there from William McCaskill about that political or structural change, that the chances of that succeeding is astronomically low.
Yeah.
Is he talking there about like generally astronomically low for everyone, or is he especially talking about rich people? Do you know?
Wait, I've been moving in the wrong direction. Just a second. Oh, now I'm too far.
Yeah.
That was a secret slide.
Here it is.
There it is.
This one, right?
Chance of success is astronomically low. I just had a comment about that, and it seems like it's clearly false, especially if you're talking about very, very rich people, right? The chances of enacting structural economic change is not astronomically low if you're very, very rich. It's actually quite, significantly more than astronomically low anyway, and the evidence of that would be that rich people try to do this all the time in ways that benefit their interests.
Yeah.
Right? So, and why would they do that if the chance of success is astronomically low? So that's a comment about that. And also, I was thinking about this, when you talk about structural change, and you frame it like you're trying to accomplish another economic system, like, it's against capitalism, you're going to have another system. Then in that frame, I think that, yeah, you could see, it's easy to understand why people would think that the chances of that succeeding is astronomically low. But you could talk about other structural changes, like enacting like a basic healthcare system in a country that is accessible to all equally for free, public funded, and that for a very rich individual or individuals in a country, it's clearly not very astronomically low. The chances of, if they try with their money and resources to do that, it seems that the chances of succeeding is, well, sort of good.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's better not to talk about like, we're gonna enact a new economic system, but talk about specific policies like basic healthcare. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, comment on that.
Yes. Yes. So I agree with what you say, except that I still want to defend that it's important to talk about systems, but first on the other things. So it is true that rich people in themselves can actually have a significant influence. I mean, that's the bad guys in my book. I mean, the Koch brothers, Murdoch, they've done so much damage. in the first case to both the possibility, effective climate action in the second, and actually also politics in the second case, also to democracy via the media. That it just shows that if you happen to be a multi-billionaire, you could do those things. A positive example is, of course, the Gates Foundation on vaccines. I mean, they have really done enormous work. But it's interesting that Gates also doesn't talk about capitalism. I mean, if you read his book on climate disaster is in the title, it's all about technology. Technology, and then that entrepreneurs and government needs to work together to scale up the technologies of the future. So, so that is interesting that those economic institutions are out of. They keep to be they. For example, they never. I mean, coming back to the earlier question, they never talk about taxation. So they want, in that sense, they want, and that is the reason why I'm a bit worried about when you say talk about specific policies. So how I understand the system, it's a number of interlocked institutions/policies that work together to then build something that is where they influence each other. So that means, of course, that if you change if you implement a new policy or you change an institution, you are already tweaking the system. But you could, and that's of course why we have varieties of capitalism, why neoliberalism didn't come with a bang. It gradually, if you look at how, for example, tax rates shifted, it was not like we had highest marginal tax rates and then suddenly it was low, it gradually eroded. So it is important to also keep the complete thing together. And the other thing about why I think it's important to talk about systems is the deeper principles for why we have an economic system. So we can argue about this, but I think the defining feature of capitalism, there are many ways to define that, but one would be the profit plays such a central role. Some people would say capital accumulation, if they have a more structuralist account. But that is, of course, you can ask, is that what the goal of an economic system should be? You could say it's welfare creation, and then that's just the most efficient means to get there. But that is hugely under debate. And so actually I forgot to mention that there are, of course, people now who are trying to really have this discussion about the economic system. Interestingly, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Olivier de Schutter, has just launched a roadmap to a non-capitalist system that will, in his view, eradicate poverty while respecting human rights and without continuing economic growth in the global north. Still global. And then that is a different system than let's continue having capitalism and then redistribute money by philanthropists.
On that note, I'm afraid we have to stop because time is out with over 5 minutes. Thank you so much for this talk.
Thanks for all your questions. And also to the people online.
There are talks coming up. We have Karine Prunkel from she's a senior fellow at Oxford, and she's going to talk about the evaluation gap and the governance of general purpose AI. That's on 13th of May, and on 27th of May we have Anton Grau-Larsen, Professor of Science, and Christoph Hohmann-Ellegard, also Professor of Organisation at the Copenhagen Business School. And the title is Something for You, Mapping the Power List of the Welfare States. So you're very welcome.